Yeah, I went ahead and wrote a DBQ about the Kendrick Lamar and Drake beef, and I think this is going to help you understand how to write the DBQ in a way that you couldn't understand it if it was just history content. But two things before we get into it. First, this wasn't my idea. A few of the students on my Discord server challenged me to this, and so, they wrote the prompt, they pulled together the document, so credit where credit is due. Second, it might surprise you based on how I look, but I actually know nothing about this beef. I mean, I know I look hip, what with my male pattern baldness and my orthopedic shoes, but I'm not. And I mention that because that means that I went into writing this in a similar situation that many of you are going into your DBQ. So, I get you, boo. Anyway, I'm going to read the whole thing and then show you how the skills are done, and I hope that you'll be able to apply this to your own DBQs on the national exam. And, just for poops and giggles, I have a whole course outlining all the skills and all the points if that's something that you need. Also, just for funsies, if you want to follow along, I linked to my finished DBQ down in the description, so get that clicky finger out and go crazy. Okay, here's the prompt that they gave me. Evaluate the extent to which Kendrick Lamar dissing Drake at the Super Bowl halftime show was justified or not considering their controversial rivalry. And then the links to all the documents are in the description in case you want to check my work. So, alright, let's begin with contextualization. Whether by design or by nature, feuds have been part and parcel of the hip-hop genre over time. In many cases, the artists participating in the feuds were at one time collaborators, but then fell out for various reasons. For example, in the early days of hip-hop, the East Coast-West Coast split was occasioned by the beef developed between Tupac Shakur and the notorious B.I.G. In 1994, Tupac was shot and subsequently believed that Biggie had a hand in the violence despite the fact that they had previously been collaborators. This led to both parties releasing diss tracks insulting the other, thus making the East-West split permanent. In the early 2000s, a similar beef developed between two luminaries of the contemporary hip-hop scene, Jay-Z and Nas. Did I say Nas? Is it Nas? Did I say that right? I don't know. Nas. Though their beef was less violent, it was still verbally vicious and carried on the hip-hop tradition of high-profile feuds which has continued to this day with Kendrick Lamar and Drake. Okay, so many of you struggle to get the contextualization point, but if you do it like I did it, you will get it every time. The number one reason students miss this point is because their contextualization isn't related to the topic of the prompt and therefore their thesis. Look, the prompt is about a beef between two contemporary rappers. So my contextualization set the stage for that particular theme, which is to say I went back in time and talked about the history of high-profile feuds between hip-hop artists. But on the other hand, if I just talked about the history of hip-hop, that would not get the point because the prompt isn't about hip-hop in general, it's about hip-hop feuds in particular. You smelling what I'm stepping in? So all that to say, contextualization has to be tightly related to the topic of the prompt. And don't miss that I named and explained specific evidence. I didn't just say, like feuds are pretty common in hip-hop. No, I mentioned a few of them by name and explained why they were relevant. Okay, so now let's get to my thesis. And let me just say, I have no idea if what I'm about to say is controversial because remember, orthopedic shoes. So if I offend anyone, consider this my preemptive apology. Okay, here's my thesis. Although Drake appeared to be the loser of his feud with Kendrick Lamar, Lamar was justified in dissing Drake at the Super Bowl halftime show because accusations were made that required answers, and more importantly, their beef was rooted in a fundamental characteristic of the hip-hop genre, namely the public construction of an authentic identity and the challenging of that identity through lyrical discourse. So notice a few things. First, your thesis does not have to be nearly this complex to earn the point, but don't judge me. It's my journey. Second, notice that I start with a counter-argument. Since Drake lost, maybe Lamar wasn't justified in dissing him in a massive public arena. But then third, I lay out my argument. Kendrick was justified in what he did. And notice how I used the language of the prompt to make sure I kept on topic in my thesis. But then I went a step further and laid out the line of reasoning that I'm going to use in the rest of my essay. Okay, so why was he justified? Well, because public accusations require public answers, and this is just the nature of hip-hop. So that means that I now have the structure of my essay. I'm going to have 3 paragraphs, each one dealing with one part of the thesis. So let's get into the first body paragraph. For this, I just lifted the counter-argument from the first part of my thesis and then went hog wild. On one hand, it could be argued that Lamar was unjustified in dissing Drake at the halftime show since it was clear that Drake had already lost the battle. Along these lines, Lamar could be viewed as a bully who delighted in kicking a man while he was already down. So that's my topic sentence, and now I've got to show evidence for it. By May of 2024, almost 3 months into the beef, both artists had released multiple tracks attempting to deride each other's character and skill. However, by this point, it appeared that Drake had lost the battle in no small part due to his uninspired tracks like The Heart Part 6, in which he admits that perhaps his only win was motivating Lamar to produce more music. The court of public opinion seemed to agree, as is reflected in the production of a popular meme depicting Lamar's #1 hit, Not Like Us, as a fierce tornado bearing down on Drake, depicted here as a tired and uninspired man. Okay, so I used the content of 2 documents to support the counter-argument. Maybe Kendrick Lamar should have kept his mouth shut since Drake had already lost the feud and everyone else seemed to agree agree that he lost. And now comes my first attempt at sourcing a document, and pay attention because I know a lot of you struggle with this skill. The creator of this meme picks up on a controversy surrounding Drake's compositions, namely that he had used artificial intelligence to write some of his lyrics. This shows again that Lamar, being a Pulitzer Prize winner, is likely the artist with the superior skills and was therefore unjustified in dissing Drake at the halftime show because Drake had already been declared the loser in the court of public opinion. So in order to source this image, I used historical situation with a little dash of point of view. For the historical situation, I mentioned the controversy of Drake using AI, and that context helps make sense out of this document. And then I talk about how Kendrick Lamar has a Pulitzer Prize, which would suggest that he's a more skilled lyricist than Drake. And if that's true, then maybe he was unjustified in dissing Drake at the Super Bowl. So my sourcing is related to my document and helps support the argument of my thesis. And those are crucial ingredients in order to earn this point. Okay, and then I close the paragraph with some more evidence. Additionally, later in the year, while Lamar continued to issue diss tracks against Drake, Drake took to the courts to sue Lamar for defamation, which he argued had harmed his reputation and career, clearly demonstrating that he had lost the stomach for continuing the lyrical beef with his enemy. All of these developments could support an argument that Lamar was unjustified in his public diss at the halftime show. Okay, so thus ends my first body paragraph, and what I tried to do in it is to show how there is some evidence that might suggest that Kendrick was not justified in dissing Drake at the Super Bowl. And that's one way to earn the complexity point. Like, it's not the only way, it's certainly not the easiest way, but it's what I did. Okay, so that's the evidence for the counter argument. Now I'm going to move into the first part of my argument, which I already laid out in my thesis. So my topic sentence will just steal from the thesis, and then I'm going to use evidence to support it. However, despite the prior evidence, it is more likely that Lamar was justified in dissing Drake. First, because accusations were made that required responses. Early in their respective careers, Lamar and Drake were friends and collaborators. In fact, Drake gave Lamar his first big break by giving him a chance to showcase his talent on the 2011 track titled Burned Alive Interlude. However, by 2013, the two had fallen out, as is demonstrated in Lamar's lyric within Big Sean's Control. I got love for you all, but I'm trying to murder you, trying to make sure your core fans never heard of you. Drake responded to the slight in an interview, saying that Lamar was essentially powerless to do him any harm. It should be noted that Lamar is not threatening to physically murder Drake, but is instead speaking metaphorically, something akin to tarnishing Drake's reputation. Okay, so there's my second sourcing attempt, and this time it was for purpose. In order to source for purpose, I need to answer the question, what did the author intend this document to do? So I mentioned that Drake spoke in metaphor in order to destroy Kendrick's reputation, and then I showed how it tied to my argument. So, okay, moving on. Even though this first official diss was somewhat generic, the escalation of the feud produced much more specific accusations that required responses from both artists. In Not Like Us, widely recognized as Lamar's greatest song of the feud, he accuses Drake of being a pedophile, saying, "Say, Drake, I hear you like him young," and trying to strike a chord, and it's probably A minor. And then here comes another attempt at sourcing, this time for POV. It should be noted that it is a well-established fact that the lyrical threats generated by such beefs are often exaggerated and contain rumors unsubstantiated by evidence for the sake of heightening the tension of the drama. However, it was a serious accusation that demanded a response. In fact, Lamar doubled down on this accusation during his halftime show in front of an audience of 133 million people. He wore a necklace with a lowercase a, which is the musical notation for an A minor chord. And now I'm going to get saucy and add my evidence beyond the document. And remember, to earn this point, you've got to name something related to the prompt that is not mentioned in the documents and that occurs within the same time period of the prompt. So here's what I said. Drake's response came in the form of a defamation lawsuit. Additionally, Drake responded by accusing Lamar of domestic abuse against his former girlfriend. This shows that Kendrick Lamar had public standing to respond to such accusations. Okay, so I named my evidence Drake's lawsuit, and then I showed how that evidence supported my topic sentence, which in turn supports the argument of my thesis. And then we're back to the document. In fact, Lamar responded to this accusation by including her in his next music video, both of them dancing together, suggesting that they were cordial and had no history of abuse. Therefore, because of the nature of feuds like this, Kendrick Lamar was justified in dissing Drake because public accusations call for public responses. Okay, so now we'll move to my second body paragraph, and since it's really just more of the same skills that I demonstrated in the last paragraph, I'll read it without comments and then save some general comments for the end. However, the most compelling reason Lamar's diss was justified comes down to the fundamental nature of hip-hop. Matthew Garley, a postgraduate linguist who has focused his study on the lyrical construction of such battles, argues that the most essential tenet of hip-hop is the artist's construction of an authentic self and the challenging of that authenticity through the means of lyrical discourse. In other words, the main goal of the rapper is to construct and present his or her authentic self to the audience by making claims about his or her values, smarts, exploits, etc., often in grandiose manners. Drake is a hip-hop artist with a long career and therefore understood the rules of public beefs like this one. In striking back against Lamar's accusations, he essentially gave his consent to have public accusations hurled back toward himself. Therefore, Lamar was justified in dissing Drake at the Super Bowl. By proving himself the better artist, Lamar earned the stage and the massive audience to say what he wanted to say about his adversary. Those are the rules. Both men agreed to them when they began the feud. After all, there's mustard on the beach. So that's my argument. Kendrick Lamar was justified in dissing Drake, and I think the evidence I had supported it pretty well. Now, I hope this helped you understand how an argument is built, and if it did, then make sure you download this document and study it a little closer and see how I did it. And who knows, fingers crossed, maybe they'll come back to you on exam day. Okay, here are a bunch of videos that'll help you prepare for your exam, and here's a link to my APSA cram course, which is going to help you score as high as possible on all the writing that you're going to have to do in May. Thanks to the students on my Discord server who pulled this all together for me, and I'll catch y'all on the flip-flop. Heimler out.